Support comes from Missouri Forest Products Association, committed to sustainable and sound conservation of the state's forests, which support more than 41,000 Missouri jobs, resulting in a $10 billion industry. ChooseWood.com.
This is St. Louis on the Air from St. Louis Public Radio. I'm Elaine Cha.
I was surprised at how strong his criticisms were.
The methods that he presented were at times incomprehensible, unclear, and flat out incorrect.
And until we can get those kinds of answers, we're like playing scientists and not able to actually be scientists.
Everyone there was wanting to protect the children and the staff. There's no doubt about that.
I'll be honest with you, it is well above my understanding of science. It's not something that just regular community members can look at and understand immediately.
In October last year, Jana Elementary in Florissant was closed after a company called Boston Chemical Data Corporation issued a report that said there was radioactive contamination in the school and that it was dangerous. Jana Elementary is in the Hazelwood School District and is located next to Coldwater Creek. That creek is radiologically contaminated. During the 1940s and 50s, Mallinckrodt Chemical Works stored waste 5 miles upstream from the school. Mallinckrodt participated in the Manhattan Project, which produced the first atomic bombs. But when it comes to evidence of radiological contamination at the elementary school, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and a private company from St. Charles agree Jana Elementary is not contaminated and it is safe. But the community and parents remain skeptical. A little later in the show, we'll talk with St. Louis Public Radio education reporter Kate Grumke about that. But before we do, let's listen to an extended conversation she had with Roger Lewis. Lewis is a professor emeritus of environmental and occupational health at St. Louis University. He's among the scientists who have looked at all the data and who agree that the school is safe. And he has serious concerns about Boston Chemical's methods and data. Here's Kate.
Is Jana Elementary School safe?
Certainly it is from a radiological point of view. The reason why I provide that caveat is that I don't know much about the interior of the building other than the data that I have seen that has been collected to evaluate that question of radiological health. But certainly from that standpoint, it is.
And why do you think that?
That's based on the studies that have been done by both the Army Corps of Engineers and SEI contractors who did a number of different projects to evaluate what the exposures might be to radioactive substances in the building.
We've seen very different takeaways from different groups conducting tests at the school, ranging from Boston Chemical Data Corporation saying there was harmful nuclear waste at the school to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers saying the school is safe. Why is there such a discrepancy here?
Well, I think that you have to look historically at some of the problems that we have with just complex scientific questions. And certainly radioactive materials in the environment is a very complex subject. Whenever you have very complex subjects, sometimes it's difficult to explain to people the uncertainty in some of the data that exists. Now, that's part of what's happening, which is that it's a complex subject which drives uncertainty often in communicating what is safe or not safe. On top of that, you have one of the parties who was a plaintiff's expert came forward with a report which provided some information about levels of radioactive materials, but it was a very incomplete report using methods that were not the and the methods did not support the conclusions that this particular author found, which was that there was harmful radioactive materials present. Certainly there were not. And that is, from my understanding of reading the reports by SEI, as well as the Army Corps of Engineers. I looked at the information as well as a colleague of mine at Washington University, Dr. Lisa Botka, and we're all in agreement that the school has never had, as far as we know, harmful levels of radioactive materials in it.
And you talked about methodology. What was the difference in methodology between the different tests that have happened?
Sure. Dr. Katolfin, who was representing plaintiffs around Coldwater Creek and elsewhere, including probably parties to Jana School, he was trying to determine if there was a signature from the Coldwater Creek contamination. In other words, is there some evidence of contamination in the school that comes from Coldwater Creek? And if so, is it at a harmful level? He determined that not only is it present from Coldwater Creek, but it was at a harmful level. But the methods that he used didn't support those conclusions. One of the things that he used was to determine if it was a signature was certain findings of lead-210. And in one of the presentations that was given, which was by Dr. Lisa Botka, it was presented that lead-210, certainly at the levels that were present at the school, were minimal in terms of causing harm, as well as they were not from Coldwater Creek. So that was one point, which is that material around the school or in the school could not be from and was not from Coldwater Creek. The second thing was the methods themselves that he used. He purported that this could be used to describe exposure, but they were not meant for exposure. They're meant to tell you is something present, excuse me, but they are not meant for telling you if there is some harmful level that could cause consequence in the body, such as cancer. And the methods are somewhat complicated, but various consensus body organizations from 1980 going forward have dismissed what he calls the microparticle hypothesis for determining exposure and harm. That's simply not supported by consensus organizations like the International Council of Radiation Protection, the Health Physics Society. And so I try to make that clear that if the public needs reassurance about a problem, they should look at what are the consensus organizations saying, not one or two investigators and not even one agency necessarily, but look at all of the information. So we had in the Jana School, we had the Army Corps of Engineers, we had SCI, and then in addition to that, if you look at the first report that the Army Corps put together, their report was peer-reviewed by the Department of Energy. They also found Dr. Katolfin's report wanting. The Missouri Department of Health and Human Services also found Dr. Katolfin's report wanting. So the methods that he presented were at times incomprehensible, unclear, and flat out incorrect for coming to the conclusion that there is harmful levels of radioactive materials in the building.
You compared this to Where's Waldo. Could you
Yes.
kind of lay out why do you
Yes.
think his report was similar to Where's Waldo?
Okay. Because the point of Where is Waldo that I pointed out is, okay, it's a signature, like a signal. So we know that Waldo is present. His methodologies help to determine if there is some contamination present from Coldwater Creek or from other places. That's what he purports to do. It turns out, though, that not only is that the method that he used incorrect, the way that he executed it, as Dr. Sabatka talked about, but it also doesn't inform what Waldo is exposed to. So let's assume for the moment that Waldo is in this room with us. Okay, he's here. But what is Waldo actually exposed to? That's a different story. So we know that if Waldo is there, maybe there is a contaminant from Coldwater Creek. But so what? Is it at a level that can cause harm? Answer is no. But the answer is Waldo there. He didn't correctly identify that either. Waldo was not there, and Waldo wasn't exposed.
I also kind of took away from what you were saying that some of this comes down to a lack of denominator. So could you also explain what was the issue with the Boston Chemical methods that had to do with a lack of denominator?
Okay, that's a great question. So when you try to evaluate exposures that might take place inside or even outdoors, and it's from a surface, such as dust on a surface, you have to know, well, how much dust is on that surface and what is the area of the surface that you're trying to evaluate. In his methodology, he doesn't describe what that surface area is. Typically, it's 100 centimeters squared. That's what I think SCI used. I think that's what the Army Corps used. It's a standard wipe area. He used a different area, which was a tape lift, putting a piece of tape down on a surface, probably putting it on a microscope slide and looking for hot particles. Okay, but we don't know for sure. It was never in his report. So if we don't know the denominator when we're trying to evaluate surface-borne contaminants, we don't know what the exposure might be because we have to extrapolate what's on a surface to what gets in the air. And the only way to do that is to know not only the mass on the surface, but the surface area. The surface area is the denominator. The surface mass is a numerator.
That's St. Louis University Professor Emeritus Roger Lewis talking with St. Louis Public Radio's Kate Grumke. During their conversation, Kate asked about exposure to radioactive material and whether any exposure is safe.
So there has been a lot of discussion over the years about what is a safe level of radioactive exposure. Most models of cancer risk that use radioactive materials in it use what's called a linear response, which means that any amount can give you the probability, although that probability might be infinitely small, of causing cancer. Well, the literature recently has indicated that small amounts of radioactivity are not necessarily going to increase your risk of cancer. And as a matter of fact, we are exposed to so much radioactivity daily. Our bodies produce radioactive decay. The cosmic radiation of the air produces that. Certainly when we go get a chest x-ray or a dental x-ray. So we're constantly in the midst of radioactive materials. Our body has learned to cope with a certain amount of that. However, what we all agree to is we want to reduce our exposure to radioactive materials to as low as reasonably possible. In other words, we want to do everything we can to keep radioactive exposure to a minimum because we don't know at what level cancer can come about due to radioactive exposure. We don't know that for sure. There's a lot of uncertainty. But if you look at the literature, you'll find that scientists are looking again at what are considered very, very low levels of radioactivity. And they're finding that the extrapolation that we once used to determine, well, is there any risk at all to small amounts of radioactivity? Well, very, 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 very little.
And I think the messenger is important too. You talked about how the backdrop of this whole situation is an outrageous environmental injustice, the Manhattan Project leaving radioactive waste in St. Louis, and that did involve the U.S. government. So
yes.
Do you think that the magnitude of that injustice has an effect on people's trust of organizations like the Army Corps of Engineers?
It does. It's unfortunate, but there's no way around it. So although our government in 1940 was a very different governmental organization with much fewer regulations when it comes. I mean, the EPA was still not in existence until, say, 1970. So the sorts of things that the government did with waste are reprehensible today. But since then, we have professionals working in all manner of government doing terrific work, but trying to get people to trust government can be really difficult. Take, the whole problems with the pandemic, with masks and everything else. And you have a situation where you have politicians that are trying to make hay out of this. And we saw that with both Josh Hawley and Cori Bush.
And do you support their calls to do more testing at the schools?
No.
You think that we have enough testing from everything that's happened?
I think that if there is more testing, it should be whatever the Army Corps has already agreed to do. I know the Army Corps has already agreed to look at all of the school properties to see if there could be possible infiltration from Coldwater Creek. So I think they're doing like topographical evaluations to see if flooding could happen. I don't think they're going to do necessarily extensive sampling. I don't see that as necessary.
The families connected to the school are feeling a lot of fear from this situation. Do you think that they were misled?
I'm pausing because it's a really complex question. And sometimes these complex questions require a lot of reflection. I think that, like I said in the forum, I don't question the motivations of anyone who gave their work, their presentations, whether it was a plaintiff's expert or anybody else. Everyone there was wanting to protect the children and the staff. There's no doubt about that. But there were different methods that were used to try to get their points across. As I said earlier, one party, I feel, didn't support their conclusions from the methods that they used, which was the plaintiff's expert, Marco Catolfin. Did that add a measure of fear? It probably did. It probably did. And soon after that report was done, the Army Corps came in, they did their study, and it found that there was no contamination of the school. But people didn't believe them. And it was months until the school district itself decided to close and abandon the school temporarily, if not forever. So I think the fear was not managed well by all of the parties. But certainly situations like this require that people look at lots of different organizations and lots of different experts before leaping to conclusions. There's all kinds of things that we thought were very dangerous in the past, such as electromagnetic fields that might cause cancer, cell phones and things like that. And I was involved in a lot of different studies like those. And we found that they were all negative in the end. But for a small amount of time, we thought that there was danger there. But in this case with Jana School, there was never any doubt that it was harmful among the experts. But the word has only recently gotten out, and I don't know if the politicians have actually gotten that word yet. I rather think they have not.
That's Roger Lewis, Professor Emeritus of Environmental and Occupational Health at St. Louis University. He spoke with STLPR education reporter Kate Grumke. When we come back, Kate joins us to put this story in greater context, and we'll learn what parents in the district are saying. This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio.
Support comes from Missouri Forest Products Association, committed to sustainable and sound conservation of the state's forests, which support more than 41,000 Missouri jobs, resulting in a $10 billion industry. ChooseWood.com.
Welcome back. I'm Elaine Cha. Before the break, we heard STLPR education reporter Kate Grumke's conversation with Roger Lewis, Professor Emeritus of Environmental and Occupational Health at St. Louis University. He spoke to his concerns about the validity of Boston Chemical Data Corporation's conclusion that radioactive contamination at Jana Elementary made the school dangerous. Kate Grumke joins us now to give greater context to this story. Welcome back to the show, and thanks for making time to talk with us today.
Thanks for having me.
Kate, before we get to what stood out to you from your conversation with Roger Lewis and what you heard from parents, you spoke with Boston Chemical's president, Marco Kaltofen, whose work has been pretty seriously criticized by Lewis and others. Kaltofen defended his work and said this.
Like a lot of people, including the parents of the school, I'd love to see that people move on to the prevention and cleanup stage rather than the debate and argument stage.
Now, we should note that Boston Chemical was hired by a plaintiff's attorney. Kate, why did Kaltofen's work have such an impact if it's being criticized this way now?
Yeah, so Kaltofen said to me that he stands by his data and his methods and is ready to move on to cleaning up the school, as you heard in that soundbite. But I kind of put together a bit of a timeline to just remember why this report did have such an impact. So there have been concerns of contamination in Coldwater Creek, and the Army Corps says that it is contaminated for years now. And this elementary school is right next to the creek, and it's even next to a place that the Army Corps says is contaminated and is currently remediating. And so parents for a long time had concerns, and so did neighbors in this community. So in October, the Parent-Teacher Association at Jana got the Boston Chemical report and sent it out to parents in a letter. And so that was when we first kind of saw these concerns come up that this report said that there was harmful levels of contamination at the school. So on October 19th, so that's about a week later, the Hazelwood School District closed Jana Elementary School. And this was when parents were absolutely terrified of what this report could mean for the safety of their kids. So that was the place that we were operating from. Was this report said that the school was unsafe. The school district closed the school to try to keep kids safe. But then in November, so about a month later, the Army Corps of Engineers released preliminary results from its own testing at the school, and it said that the school was safe. And I think what's interesting is at the time, the Army Corps wouldn't comment on Boston Chemical's report. They said that the methods were inconsistent with how they do their evaluations, but they weren't directly giving, for example, reporters information about what they found was not reliable about that first report. Then about a week later, that St. Charles-based firm also came in and said that the school was safe. So that was all in November. And so that Army Corps information at the time, that was preliminary. So within the last about month and a half, they've released their 3 final reports from the school. And they say that all 3 reports, all of their testing, found that the school is radiologically safe. And then at the same time, St. Louis University held a technical forum, which is where we heard from Roger Lewis and from Lisa Botka at Washington University, who both said they looked at all this testing and that they agreed that the school is radiologically safe.
Now, going back to Roger Lewis, and I really appreciate your going through sort of the timeline of when information was available and how it got out. With what Roger Lewis and others had presented at St. Louis University, of the purely scientific points that Lewis made, what stood out to you the most?
I was surprised at how strong his criticisms were of the methods that Boston Chemical used. He says very strongly that the methods that they used would not be useful for determining exposure. And then Lisa Botka from Washington University also spoke about the ways that scientists know where radioactive contamination might have come from. And so he said that he does not believe that it is consistent with something that would come from rainwater rather than from Mallinckrodt waste. So they really did kind of have a lot of criticisms of the ways that those methods were used. And I think if people are interested in learning more about that science behind all of this, the SLU Technical Forum is available on YouTube. I think it's very dense. It's very, very scientific. But if you're interested in learning more about that, that is available publicly.
I think that gets to an interesting point. something that stood out to me as I was listening to your conversation with Roger Lewis. He talked with you about people's response to data in past reports and the current one, and that includes findings by the Army Corps of Engineers and St. Charles-based SCI Engineering, which said that Jana Elementary was safe last fall, and then private firm Boston Chemical Data Corporation said that it's not. And Lewis also said that there's a mismatch, right, between those that do the science and those who are hearing about it. Talk with us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I thought that it was really interesting to hear from him about the issues that he found with communication just throughout this whole time. And this is such a complicated scientific subject. I have read big chunks of the Army Corps' reports, but I'll be honest with you, it is well above my understanding of science. It's not something that just regular community members can look at and understand immediately. And then when you add to that, this is so scary. These are kids we're talking about, and it's such a scary thing, which adds emotion and makes it, again, even harder to kind of come to a conclusion about what's going on. Mm-hmm. So I think Lewis's points about that the communication was not good, that the parties did not do a good job managing fear in the time after these reports were coming out. Mm-hmm. I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah. I'm talking with Kate Grumke, who's STLPR's education reporter, and we're discussing the latest report that has been put out by the Army Corps of Engineers about radiological safety at Jana Elementary. Now, the Corps presented the results of its latest report on June 8th, so that was this past Thursday night, and you were there, Kate. Overall, how did community members seem to be taking what was shared, especially given what you've just mentioned about fear?
So I think it was a mixed reaction in the room, and I will say that the room was kind of empty, and this was a criticism that the PTA president, Ashley Bernard from Jana Elementary, had, that she felt like this was not communicated well to the community to make sure they could show up and ask questions and hear what was being presented from the Army Corps. But there were a lot of people that didn't really buy what they were saying, that are still really worried about what it meant that their kids were in the school for so long. But I also talked to people who had the opposite reaction and now trust the Army Corps' results and do believe that Jana Elementary is safe. So I think that there are some people that do believe what the Army Corps is saying, but there's still a lack of trust in some of the community.
Yeah, and was that any surprise to you? I mean, the number of people who are in the room, what the feeling seemed to be like in there?
I think it's not a surprise because all of this, we're talking about one specific school, but it is true that there is contamination all over North County, especially around Coldwater Creek. At this presentation, the Army Corps was talking about all kinds of different sites, even in downtown St. Louis. Mm-hmm. And they talked about there are about 40 areas along Coldwater Creek where we know that contamination exists right now. So I think it's important to understand that history of contamination, of this environmental injustice, has made it the relationship really strained, I think, between the Army Corps and the community. Mm-hmm. And so people have trouble trusting what they're saying.
Yeah. No, Jana Elementary PTA president, you've mentioned, Ashley Bernard, is one of the community members you talked with at that meeting on Thursday. Here's what she told you.
To get answers for these kinds of questions is really vital. And until we can get those kinds of answers, we're like playing scientists and not able to actually be scientists about this. And that is really hard. And I don't think we're playing lightly. Like, we're not playing dress up for fun. We're playing like with real numbers because this is really real to us. Like, our kids go here. We live here. And so, and you hear the stories, right? Like, it's not like we're just like, well, radioactivity is not great, but we haven't heard of anybody being sick. No, this community is full of sick people. Like, and I don't think that is even, like, we don't want to be Chicken Little, right? Like, we're not screaming that the sky is falling. But there are really real sick people here, and their stories are just completely being obscured by this "it's safe" narrative.
What Bernard says about sick people, it takes me back to a conversation we had on the show about the community activist work of Mary Osco, who died of cancer that she, her family, and fellow activists attribute to years of exposure to Coldwater Creek contamination. Now, Mary was an adult in her early 50s with grown children when she found out she was sick, but with Hazelwood and Jana Elementary, as you've pointed out, I mean, there's a question of health and safety of children. So do you think that the remediation of spots in Coldwater Creek, plus the criticism that you've heard from scientists like Roger Lewis, that over time that will allay some of the fears that community members have, whether they have any school-aged kids in their lives or not?
I'm not sure. I think that's hard to know. But I do think that what Ashley is calling for, I think it's important to highlight that. So she wants to see testing done at the school by all the people who have done testing before, but at the same time. Mm-hmm. So she wants a way to actually directly compare results between these different groups. Mm-hmm. She also she wants there to be remediation done at the school, wants it to be cleaned up, but she is also worried that she won't trust the cleanup because she's worried that what the Army Corps leaves behind would be at a level that she wouldn't find safe. Okay. And some of what she's calling for is in this Justice for Jana Act, which the U.S. Senate passed. Senator Josh Hawley was the sponsor of that, and then Representative Cori Bush has sponsored her own version of that in the House, which it has not passed the House yet, so it's still under consideration. But that act would clean up Jana Elementary School, direct the U.S. Army Corps to test all Hazelwood schools. Mm-hmm. It would create a fund for schools impacted by the Manhattan Project waste. And then it would also direct the Department of Energy to review all of the testing from Jana. So kind of what Ashley is talking about, to see which of the tests are reliable.
Yeah. And then just as a quick last question, do you have any insight into what Hazelwood School District will do with Jana Elementary as a school or as a site now that the Army Corps of Engineers has issued this latest report?
They've said that their plans are not changing, so it will be closed for the foreseeable future.
Okay. Kate Grumke is STLPR's education reporter. Thanks, Kate, so much for this conversation.
Today's episode was produced by Alex Hoyer.
Audio engineering and podcast design by Aaron Dork.
Our executive producer is Alex Hoyer.
St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. Understanding starts here.
Our podcast proudly supports St. Louis artists by using music from Life Creative Group.
Do you find yourself regularly listening to episodes of St. Louis on the Air? Suggest us to a friend you think might enjoy our conversations. And leave us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts on the App Store. It's the simplest way to help people discover our show. Thanks.
St. Louis Public Radio is a member-supported service of the University of Missouri St. Louis.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association. Missouri produces wood pallets, railroad ties, white oak barrels, hardwood floors, and more. Details on the variety of products made in the state are at choosewood.com.